Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of challenging source material and hand you the key insights, perspective, and sometimes the jaw-dropping moments you need to be truly well-informed.
hmm
Today, we are undertaking a monumental deep dive into the intellectual and moral evolution of Frederick Douglass.
And we're focusing specifically on his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, which came out in 1855.
And this is a crucial choice of source material, right? Because
Okay.
as the source notes, this isn't just a sequel.
No, not at all. It's a profound act of self-redefinition. When most people think of Douglass, they focus on that first book, the 1845 narrative.
Right, the one that's just this tight, devastating summary of his life in bondage.
Exactly. But this 1855 text, it's something much larger. It is, you could say, his personal and political declaration of independence.
Okay, let's unpack that central question right away, because it really is the key to this whole document.
Yeah.
Why, just 10 years after the massive success of his first memoir, a book celebrated globally for its sheer power, why did Douglass feel, as he put it, compelled to write the story of his life again?
Well, the initial reason for that first book, the 1845 narrative, it was purely defensive and tragically necessary. After he became this celebrated orator, critics in the North, particularly those who were against the anti-slavery movement, they just refused to believe he could have ever been a slave.
They said he was too articulate.
Too articulate, too educated, too charismatic. Yeah, they basically accused him of being an imposter.
Wow. So his first book was just to prove he was who he said he was.
Precisely. It was forced to provide explicit, verifiable proof. He had to give names of persons, places, and dates.
And the moment he did that,
He put his life in extreme danger. He was a fugitive. And by giving those details, he basically signed a warrant for his own re-enslavement.
so the very act of writing his own history of escape, quote, endangered my liberty.
Absolutely. The sources tell us that the fame and the details from the narrative actually led him to seek refuge from Republican slavery in monarchical England.
Right, between 1845 and 1847.
Yes, he became this international celebrity, but every single time he stepped back onto American soil, he was still, technically the property of Hugh Auld.
That context is just, it's vital. So if the first book was a necessary defensive account of his past,
Then My Bondage and My Freedom is so much more ambitious. It's a thorough revision of the significance of that life.
okay, so he's charting his mental, moral, and political evolution.
Yes, and staking a claim to intellectual authority far beyond just being an escaped slave who could tell a good story.
And that's where that phrase you mentioned, its author's Declaration of Independence, really lands.
It does. In this second, much longer, more analytical work, Douglass revises history to show his own political maturation. He establishes his core philosophy not just about the cruelty of slavery,
Yeah.
but what it does to the American soul.
And how he came to separate himself politically from the abolitionists who first lifted him up.
This text is where he truly becomes his own man.
It sets the stage perfectly for our first major theme, which is, I think, the most surprising part of his critique, his devastating psychological analysis of the system itself. He argues slavery corrupts everyone it touches, but he focuses really on the master.
That is his core impartial thesis. Douglass argues that the slaveholder, by imposing bondage on others, becomes, quote, the author of his own subjection.
So he's not just looking at it as bad luck for the slave.
No, he sees it as a systematic destroyer of the enslaver's moral fiber.
He goes straight to the heart of it when he says, under the whole heavens there's no relation more unfavorable to the development of honorable character than that sustained by the slaveholder to the slave. So why is that relationship specifically so toxic to the master's character?
Because it removes every natural check on their worst instincts.
Yeah.
He explains that reason is imprisoned here and passions run wild.
Okay, so it's about absolute power.
Imagine being in a position where, from the moment you wake up, you can command total obedience, and the only force governing your actions is your own will, your own caprice.
There's no law, no social censure, no consequence for cruelty.
It's an impossible position for any human character to sustain integrity.
So it's the context, not the person, that creates the monster. He uses Captain Anthony, his first master, as an example. He says Anthony was not, by nature, worse than other men, but the system made him capable of these outrages, deep, dark, and nameless.
Exactly. The system removes all the natural restraints of free society that keep ordinary people, respectable and humane and accountable.
Douglass sees the slaveholder, as well as the slave, as the victim of the slave system.
He does, though the master's misery is self-imposed and moral. The master essentially poisons his own soul. And that spiritual death is what enables the continued physical bondage of others.
And the physical world itself was designed to perpetuate this corruption. Douglass goes into great detail about the geography and the architecture of power on Colonel Edward Lloyd's estate.
Cole Lloyd's home plantation was a deliberate closed system. It was secluded. It was dark.
It was intentionally far away from any town or village.
Yes, and Douglass emphasizes this isolation was critical. It was designed to prevent the escape of its secrets and to guard against any dangerous influence from the outside world.
That is an incredible detail. The very physical location was a tool of oppression.
Absolutely. It was designed to ensure that the horrors that happened within its boundaries remained totally invisible to the moral scrutiny of free society.
And that isolation, it extended to everything, even labor.
He notes that all the skilled mechanics, the blacksmiths, coopers, wheelwrights, they were all slaves. Even commerce was excluded.
So the produce went to Baltimore on Cole Lloyd's own ships, with his own slaves as the crew.
Right, no outside vendors, no free laborers, no casual visitors. Everything stayed within that corrupt hidden circuit, insulating the masters from shame.
This structure naturally gives absolute power to the overseer.
It does. The master is too removed, too insulated by his own system of luxury to handle the messy business of enforcement himself.
The overseers, he says, stand between the slave and all civil constitutions. Their word is law.
And the master intentionally refuses to listen to complaints against them, because if a master listened, it would be seen as undermining authority.
Which would occasion great loss of time and labor, and basically force the master into the role of an overseer himself.
So the hierarchy ensures moral accountability is just delegated away until it vanishes completely.
It's the bureaucracy of evil, and it's the system that allows for the horrifying case of his Aunt Esther, a memory Douglass never forgot.
This account of Esther's whipping is one of the most vivid and painful descriptions in American literature. Douglass makes it clear her suffering was purely a byproduct of the master's unrestrained passion.
Not some kind of economic necessity.
Not at all. Esther possessed personal beauty, which Douglass notes was ever a curse to the slave girl.
She was a desirable young woman, and Captain Anthony's motives toward her were plainly brutal and selfish.
So when she started a relationship with a handsome young man, Ned Roberts, Captain Anthony forbade it, out of pure jealousy.
And when she broke that order, the punishment was just a horrifying display of vengeance.
And Douglass, as a small boy, witnessed the entire scene through cracks in the closet boards. He describes her being tied by her wrists to a staple in the joist, arms drawn tight, back laid bare.
The sources emphasize that Captain Anthony was cruelly deliberate and protracted the torture, ignoring her cries of, "Have mercy, oh, have mercy."
It wasn't a quick punishment. It was a psychological performance designed to humiliate and destroy her spirit.
And this act motivated by raw, jealous rage.
It was the first thing that fundamentally shattered young Douglass's perception of slavery. He says the scene made him begin to inquire into the nature of slavery. It revealed the true nature of his bondage, that he was subject not just to work, but to the uncontrolled passions of another human being.
And that revelation, that cruelty isn't incidental but fundamental to the relationship, is reinforced by the second crucial case study here. The murder of Denby by the overseer, Austin Gore.
And here the motivation shifts from passion to cold, calculated duty.
Gore was one of the worst, described as whipping from a sense of duty.
A man of cold, severe disposition. His guiding maxim was terrifying. It was better for a dozen slaves suffer under the lash without fault than that the master or the overseer should seem to have been wrong in the presence of the slave.
So preserving the master's image of infallibility matters most, even more than a human life.
Exactly. So when Denby, who was a valuable slave, retreated into a creek after a flogging and refused to come out, Gore just raised his gun, took aim, and shot him dead.
And the sources stress the calculation involved.
Gore's justification was that Denby was unmanageable and had set a dangerous example.
That justification is what chills you. It was necessary to kill Denby not because he was escaping, but because if one slave was allowed to get away with defying an order,
it would mean an end to all rule and order. Gore turned murder into a bureaucratic necessity.
And of course, Colonel Lloyd accepted the explanation.
Entirely. The crime was never submitted to judicial investigation because the testimony of slaves was worthless. Local public opinion provided the loophole, crystallized in that grotesque proverb Douglass quotes.
Worth but half a cent to kill a nigger and a half a cent to bury him.
It's horrifying, but it proves Douglass's point. Cruelty wasn't an aberration. It was a necessary part of maintaining the legal and social framework that supported absolute unchecked power.
Having established the system's reliance on violence and total isolation, we have to turn to the counterweapon Douglass developed, the intellectual awakening that began in Baltimore. His departure from the plantation at 8 or 9 years old, sent to serve Master Hugh Auld and his wife Sophia, was an ecstatic break from that terror.
The contrast was immediate and profound. On the plantation, his physical troubles were constant hunger and cold.
Sleeping in a cornmeal bag, bare feet cracked by frost, eating ash cake,
with ashes baked right into it. In Baltimore, he got carpets, a straw bed with covers, good clothes, regular food.
He describes this shift as almost miraculous, and he found this surprising initial connection with Mrs. Sophia Auld,
who had never been a slaveholder before. And she was key to his survival and growth at first. The sources describe her as kind, gentle, and cheerful.
Free of the petulance and bad humor which generally characterize slaveholding ladies.
Right. For a time, she treated him as a child, not as property. A shocking anomaly. Douglass even thought of her as something more akin to a mother than a slaveholding mistress.
And that relationship, rooted in her natural goodness, led to the critical moment where she happily agreed to teach him to read. She taught him the alphabet, simple words.
But this innate human kindness soon clashed violently with the system. And this is where Douglass provides his deep analysis of character corruption.
He says Mrs. Auld was exposed to the fatal poison of irresponsible power.
And it began to work on her character instantly.
What specific changes did he see in her?
He describes her face hardening. Her features lost their kindness, her voice lost its cheerfulness, her eyes began to flash with that petulance he expected. She went from being his gentle tutor to his stern adversary.
She started to hate the very idea of seeing him with a book.
Douglass saw the system turn a naturally good woman into a vessel of cruelty and prejudice. It was a live demonstration of how slavery damages the soul of the oppressor.
And the immediate shutdown came from Master Hugh Auld. He discovered the lessons and forbade them instantly, and in doing so, gave Douglass what he calls the true philosophy of slavery.
Master Hugh's prohibition was the greatest accidental gift of his life. He stated it plainly. If you teach a slave to read, he becomes unfit for the duties of a slave.
And will surely aspire to freedom.
Right. Douglass realized in that moment that if his master feared knowledge that much, then knowledge had to be the pathway to liberty.
That prohibition was just a powerful confirmation for him, and so he embarks on this ingenious campaign of self-education.
Using the urban landscape of Baltimore as his secret schoolhouse, he had to resort to methods that he found personally degrading, what he called indirections by no means congenial to my nature.
And his curriculum relied on the children of the streets.
He used white playmates as tutors, and the currency he used was food.
That image of trading food for words is so powerful, the bread for lessons economy.
Yes. He said, for a single biscuit, any of my hungry little comrades would give me a lesson more valuable to me than bread. He recognized that while they had physical freedom, they were hungry. He had limited food, but his hunger for knowledge was infinite.
And he also taught himself to write, turning the shipyard into a classroom.
He describes watching the carpenters mark ship timbers with their initials S for starboard, L for larboard. He would then challenge the white boys, claiming he could write as well as them, and have them demonstrate letters.
And later he'd practice in secret, using discarded copybooks.
Meticulously writing between the lines of Master Tommy's used copybooks. Just incredible ingenuity.
All of this intellectual scaffolding culminates with the discovery of one single revolutionary book, The Columbian Orator.
This was the intellectual breakthrough. It was an anthology of eloquent speeches and dialogues from history, all denouncing oppression and slavery. It didn't just teach him to read complex prose.
It taught him how to structure an argument for human rights.
It fundamentally shifted his worldview. He writes that reading this book solidified his conviction. It eliminated any lingering doubts he held that the Almighty in some way ordained slavery.
He realized he had penetrated the secret of all slavery and oppression and found their true foundation in the pride, the power, and the avarice of man.
It gave him the logical framework he needed to challenge the entire system. It moved his discontent from a personal complaint to a philosophical conviction.
But this profound intellectual leap brought him not joy, but intense misery and discontent. He laments, knowledge had come, light had penetrated the moral dungeon where I dwelt.
He was burdened by a terrible awareness. He was too thoughtful to be happy, writing that he almost envied my fellow slaves their stupid contentment.
The knowledge revealed the frightful dragon, but critically, it opened no way for my escape.
Exactly. He knew the problem, but he couldn't see the solution. And this knowledge changed his relationship with Mrs. Old one last time, proving that where once they were friends by nature, slavery made us enemies.
That state of internal conflict, knowing the injustice but lacking the means to escape, marked the end of his relative comfort in Baltimore. Master Thomas Auld regained control of him and sent him back to the Eastern Shore, which initiated the ultimate test of his will.
And this period was marked by a physical deprivation he hadn't experienced since his earliest childhood. Master Thomas was known for his stinginess, and his second wife, Rowena Hamilton, was described as having the ability to make him as cruel as herself.
So Douglass was subjected to intense hunger again.
The weekly ration was less than half the already meager allowance of Colonel Lloyd's estate.
He was reduced to stealing or begging just to survive. And this is where he develops that remarkable philosophical justification for stealing from his master.
It's a classic example of slave logic turning the master's legal premise against him. Douglass acknowledged hating the concept of stealing, but he viewed taking food as merely removing his own property.
Since his labor and person belonged to Master Thomas and the master deprived him of necessities,
He deduced the right to supply himself.
he makes the distinction almost humorously but with deep seriousness. At first, he owned it in the tub, and last he owned it in me. The food had merely changed containers.
This period also highlighted the deep spiritual hypocrisy that defined the system. Master Thomas was converted at a camp meeting, which initially gave Douglass hope. He thought, if he has got religion, he will emancipate his slaves.
But his newfound piety changed nothing.
Nothing. He continued to starve his slaves while lavishly stuffing the traveling preachers. His house became the preacher's home.
This confirmed the slave creed. He can't go to heaven with our blood in his skirts.
It did. And furthermore, when Douglass tried to start a Sabbath school for other young black men, Master Thomas immediately shut it down.
So the religion of the South was a means of control, not liberation.
Exactly. And this combination of starvation and his perceived liking for knowledge deemed him unsuited to his wants. So he was sent to Edward Covey to be broken.
Covey was a poor, pious farmer, notorious as a professional slave breaker.
Who used this cruel reputation to get his farm tilled cheaply. And Covey's tactics were comprehensive. Hard, constant, worked on to midnight, and unrelenting paranoid surveillance.
This surveillance earned him that unforgettable nickname, the Snake.
Indeed. Covey had this uncanny ability to make slaves feel he was always present. He was known for practicing adroitly managed surprises, creeping and crawling behind stumps and bushes.
Douglass notes that one half of his proficiency in the art of Negro breaking consisted, I should think, in this species of cunning.
The constant uncertainty and fear were as damaging as the physical labor.
And the breaking process was effective. Douglass was whipped every week during the first 6 months.
The heavy labor, the constant fear, the beatings. It left him completely wrecked, changed, and bewildered. He lost his youthful zeal and became, as he described it, a brute.
The climax of this degradation came after a severe spell of labor. He was suffering from sunstroke, working the fan, and he collapsed.
And Covey, in his usual brutal fashion, kicked him and violently struck him with a hickory slab, leaving a large bleeding gash on his head.
In desperation, Douglass ran 7 miles to appeal directly to Captain Auld, his master. What was Auld's response?
Well, Auld, though initially agitated by the blood and the state of the slave, quickly reverted to the system's logic. He found immediate excuses for Covey's actions.
Demanding what Douglass expected him to do.
Right. Auld's conclusion was predictable and cruel. Douglass deserved the flogging and was only trying to get out of work. The guilt of a slave is always presumed.
Having been rejected by his legal master, Douglass returned, but he received a crucial piece of psychological preparation first.
He was helped by an older slave named Sandy, who gave him a root, assuring him it was a charm that would prevent him from being whipped if he carried it on his right side.
Whether the root had actual power is irrelevant.
Right, completely.
Right.
What mattered was the psychological resolve it provided. Douglass went back with a commitment to stand up for himself.
And the next confrontation was the true turning point.
Covey, true to his snake-like way, sneaked into the stable, intending to tie Douglass's legs to beat him. Douglass, remembering his pledge and maybe fortified by the root, gave a sudden spring and refused to be tied.
What followed was a violent 2-hour rough-and-tumble fight.
It was brutal, raw resistance. Douglass resisted powerfully, refusing to be beaten down. He held Covey in a chokehold for a time. Covey, the professional slave breaker, was shocked and humiliated.
He was exposed in that moment as a cowardly tyrant.
And the result was astonishing. Covey gave up. Douglass was never whipped again during his remaining 6 months there.
That fight was his true internal liberation.
Yes. He writes that he had reached the point at which I was not afraid to die. He continues, "This spirit made me a freeman in fact, while I remained a slave in form."
It was a resurrection from the dark and pestiferous tomb of slavery to the heaven of comparative freedom.
It was. And he draws a timeless lesson from this, one applicable to all those trapped in oppression.
Which is?
He concludes that he is whipped oftenest, who is whipped easiest, and that slave who has the courage to stand up for himself against the overseer becomes, in the end, a free man, even though he sustained the formal relation of a slave.
So resistance, even physical violence, can break the master's power.
That internal freedom paved the way for Douglass to look outward again, leading him to attempt his first act of collective external liberation.
After the confrontation with Covey, Douglass was sent to William Freeland's farm, where he was treated with more justice and less brutality.
Right.
But, as we learned earlier, the kindness of a master only provides the mind with the space to aspire to full freedom.
Freeland was a kind master, which only increased Douglass's discontent. It proved that the kindness of a slave master only gilds the chain of slavery without reducing its weight.
Freedom from constant torture gives the mind space to aspire.
And this is where he began to plan his first escape in 1836 with his band of brothers, Henry, John, Charles, and Elisha.
He educated them, sharing the principles he'd learned from the Columbian orator. Their escape plan was bold, planning to take a canoe up the Chesapeake Bay.
And their secret signal was remarkably poignant. They communicated through song,
singing, "O Canaan, sweet Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan."
With the North as their symbolic promised land, they had forged this deep intellectual brotherhood in preparation.
Tragically, they were betrayed, arrested, and imprisoned. As the leader, Douglass was in severe danger,
Potentially being sold far south. And this is where we see Master Thomas Auld exhibit a brief, complex moment of humanity.
He rejected very tempting offers from slave traders.
Auld confessed that money could not tempt him to sell me to the far south. He feared for Douglass's safety because of the prejudice against him locally. He knew Douglass would likely be killed or brutalized.
A conditional compassion, perhaps?
Maybe. Auld ultimately sent Douglass back to Baltimore to work for Master Hugh, ostensibly for his safety. And this transition allowed Douglass to reflect on a crucial psychological tool of bondage: the paradox of the slave holiday.
This is one of the most remarkable pieces of sociological analysis in the entire work.
It really is. Douglass argues that the annual Christmas and New Year's holiday, which suspended work for several days, was not granted out of genuine benevolence.
It was a highly cynical safety valve.
A safety valve designed to carry off the explosive elements of discontent inherent in perpetual bondage.
So masters intentionally encouraged wild and low sports, especially drunkenness.
They would even make bets on who could drink the most whiskey, leading to the slaves engaging in scandalous and loathsome scenes.
And the goal of promoting this degradation was purely strategic, wasn't it?
Utterly cynical. The goal was twofold. First, to keep the slaves' minds occupied with prospective pleasure within the limits of slavery. They were focused on the next drunken revelry, not on escape. And second, more importantly, the resulting hangovers and self-degradation were designed to disgust the slaves with their temporary freedom, making them glad to return to the structure and discipline of work.
So the master basically provided a controlled period of debauchery to prove that the slaves couldn't handle liberty.
He was calculated psychological control. Douglass states plainly that the sober, thinking slave is the dangerous one. He makes a bold prediction. If masters were to stop the holidays, the South would blaze with insurrections.
The holidays are not kindness. They are a prudent regard to the safety of the slave system.
Exactly. And when Douglass returned to Baltimore, he began working as a ship caulker, earning a good wage. But this productive labor only brought the nature of his bondage into sharper focus.
Through the open robbery of his wages by Master Hugh.
That open robbery was the final defining indignity. Master Hugh would wait until Saturday night, make Douglass hand over every cent, and then count it, often asking, "Is that all?"
This practice, Douglass notes, kept the nature and character of slavery constantly before me.
It wasn't just the lost money. It was the denial of his right to the fruits of his own labor.
He understood that if Master Hugh occasionally gave him a shilling back,
It was an admission of my right to the whole sum. But by taking it all, Hugh asserted absolute ownership over Douglass's very humanity. And this constant, explicit denial, coupled with Master Hugh's refusal to let him hire his own time, pushed Douglass past the breaking point.
Leading to his second successful departure on September 3, 1838, using a sailor's protection papers. Douglass escapes, but the reality of his newly attained liberty in the North was initially terrifying. He gets to New York and is instantly struck by a profound sense of loneliness and insecurity.
New York, 17 years before the book's publication, was fraught with danger for a fugitive. The Fugitive Slave Act loomed large.
He was without home, without friends, without work, without money.
And without any definite knowledge of which way to go. He notes that he was more fearful of human brothers than of hungry wolves.
That fear helps him understand why some slaves would voluntarily return to bondage, the security of a known system over the terrifying anarchy of liberty.
He was eventually helped by a kind sailor and directed toward New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he found security with a free black family, the Johnsons, who kindly renamed him Frederick Douglass.
And this community was his first taste of real American freedom.
New Bedford provided a striking and gratifying contrast to the South. It was a thriving, organized black community.
The source highlights that black children went to school side by side with white children without objection.
And black men were prepared to fight for liberty to the death. He recounts a story of how the black community successfully intimidated a would-be Judas who threatened to betray a fugitive, showcasing their deep-seated fighting spirit.
Yet, despite the welcome, the shadow of Southern prejudice still followed him. He was denied work at his trade, caulking.
Because of prejudice from white laborers. He was immediately told by a shipowner to go to work, only to be informed that every white man would leave the ship if I struck a blow upon her.
So he was free to work, though not at my trade.
He took up any common labor he could find, sawing wood, digging cellars, rolling oil casks, to earn his first free dollar, which was a profound moment of true independence.
His path to fame began when he discovered William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery paper, The Liberator,
and attended a convention at Nantucket in 1841, where he delivered his impromptu debut speech.
The speech was a massive success. But this success initiated a problematic relationship with his early abolitionist mentors.
Garrison and his peers, while encouraging, failed to fathom Douglass's highest intellectual qualities. They saw him as a powerful tool rather than a colleague.
They encouraged him to stick strictly to the pathetic narrative and irresistible mimicry of plantation life.
Rather than engaging in deep intellectual discourse, they wanted him to be a brand new fact.
Which is a subtle but definite racial condescension. They wanted the former slave to describe the trauma, but not to engage in political philosophy.
They felt his eloquent speech might confuse audiences, making them doubt he was ever a slave at all. Ironically, the same critique that forced him to write his first narrative.
And this tension eventually led to the major conflict detailed in this book. His definitive break with Garrison in 1851.
The central point of divergence came down to the U.S. Constitution and the means of achieving freedom.
Garrison and his followers were staunch disunionists. They believed the Constitution was inherently pro-slavery.
A covenant with death. And therefore, they refused to participate in the political process, advocating for moral exhortation and separation.
And Douglass, informed by his continued self-study, came to disagree, preferring political action.
Exactly. Douglass evolved toward pragmatism. He began to argue that the Constitution, when interpreted according to its stated principles of liberty and justice, could actually be read as an anti-slavery document.
This shift meant he could no longer stand with Garrison. He wanted to work within the system.
Using the vote, legislative power, a decision that cemented his full political and intellectual independence from his early mentors.
His experience touring Britain and Ireland between 1845 and 1847 also played a huge role in clarifying his self-identity.
It did. The sources remind us he was still subject to American prejudice even abroad, being denied a cabin seat on the ship Cambria.
But once he landed in Ireland, the experience was transformative.
He describes the shift in identity with profound clarity, writing, "I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man."
He was seen dining with the Lord Mayor of Dublin.
Enjoying an atmosphere free of American caste, he met men and women of high culture who treated him with genuine kindness and respect. This global reception reinforced his understanding of American hypocrisy and shame.
And this journey, of course, led to his friends in England raising a fund to buy his freedom.
A ransom that removed the painful liability to be returned again to slavery. He was purchased for £150 sterling, but he never viewed it as a legitimate transaction. He sought his money extorted by a robber.
This acquisition of legal freedom allowed him to return to America as a fully independent man.
And he also recognized that the European experience gave him the moral authority to appeal to the British public, not just for the slave, but for the slaveholder.
A remarkable nuance for a former slave.
He understood that slavery is so blinding to all around that the surrounding community lacks the moral stamina to remove it themselves. It requires international and external pressure to break down the insularity of the slave power.
In our final section, Douglass steps back, using all the experience and intellectual rigor he's gained to deliver his absolute definition of the slave's condition. And he argues with cold, hard logic that the system requires cruelty to function.
His definition is comprehensive and utterly damning. He goes beyond describing suffering. He defines the slave as a legal entity, not merely oppressed, but a chattel in the eye of the law.
Completely divested of all rights. A slave has no wife, no children, no country, and no home.
And the denial of rights extended even to his internal life and future. That's the deepest cut. Douglass asserts that a slave can acquire nothing but what must belong to another.
His own good, his conscience, his intellect, his affections are all set aside by the master.
It's a system designed for the total erasure of personhood.
And this leads to his shocking, paradoxical argument that better treatment actually destroys the slave's value.
It is a profound, if counterintuitive, piece of analysis. He calls it a marvelous proposition that the better you treat a slave, the more you destroy his value as a slave and enhance the probability of his eluding the grasp of the slaveholder.
He explains this using his own experience at Covey's. When he was whipped daily, his only concern was survival.
He explains, "Life was all I cared for. When I was looking for the blow about to be inflicted upon my head, I was not thinking of my liberty, it was my life. The constant threat suppressed all higher aspirations."
But once the immediate physical threat stops, once the blows cease, the mind is free to think.
And then came the longing for liberty. A slave with a bad master aspires to a better one. A slave with the best master aspires to be his own master.
Therefore, the system, to maintain the status quo, must prevent the slave from thinking.
So the system requires the perpetual brutalization of the slave, not as an incidental vice of a few bad masters, but as an integral function of the institution.
The whip, the chain, the gag, the thumb screw, the bloodhound are not incidental abuses.
They are indispensably necessary to the relation of master and slave. To be held as property, the slave must be continuously beaten down and kept ignorant. If the slave is allowed to think or to feel or to aspire, they cease being property.
This comprehensive critique underpins his most famous denunciation of the American character delivered in his 1852 address, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July."
He stood before a nation celebrating liberty and declared that he stood with the crushed and bleeding slave, judging the nation as false to the past, false to the present.
Condemning the nation's hideous and revolting hypocrisy in the strongest possible terms.
And he also pointed out how American prejudice wasn't organic to all immigrants, but was actively taught upon arrival. He specifically referenced the Irish population.
He notes that the Irish people, who he described as warm-hearted, generous, and sympathizing with the oppressed everywhere, were taught upon arrival in America to hate and despise the colored people.
They were convinced that black laborers were eating the bread that belonged to them, leading to immediate racial conflict in northern cities.
A cynical strategy to pit labor against itself.
A classic divide and conquer. Yet despite cataloging decades of relentless cruelty and institutional corruption, Douglass maintains a powerful final optimism in this text.
He asserts that the anti-slavery cause is based on the very essence of justice, liberty, and love, which is immovable as the throne of God.
And it will inevitably triumph. His belief rested on the moral life of human society, not on the immediate political landscape. He moved from being a victim of the system to being a political philosopher who recognized the inherent weakness of oppression. It is morally unsustainable.
What a monumental journey, and what an exhaustive philosophical critique. To recap for you, the learner, this deep dive into my bondage and my freedom traces Douglass's arc from chattel to self-made philosopher, defined by 3 critical movements.
First, the absolute importance of seizing knowledge, even the most clandestine ways, like trading bread for reading lessons, recognizing knowledge as the secret the master feared most.
Second, the psychological power of physical resistance. that fight with Covey, which proved that freedom is first achieved internally when you reach the point where you are not afraid to die.
And third, the assertion of complete political and moral independence from all controlling influences, whether they be masters, the corrupt church, or even well-meaning abolitionist mentors like Garrison.
Douglass's tree declaration of independence meant breaking both the external chains and the internal psychological bonds, refusing to be anyone's brand new fact.
And we focus heavily on the philosophical and physical hardships that Douglass overcame. But the sources include one of the most poignant obstacles that prevented thousands of slaves from escaping:
What was that?
the strong cords of affection.
He often reflected on this, noting that the thought of leaving his warm-hearted friends in Baltimore was one of his greatest obstacles to running away.
Freedom for him was not an entirely joyful act. It was a profound act of self-extraction.
In a poignant passage in a letter to his old master, Thomas Auld, he expresses the agony of his success.
He notes that he is haunted by his family left behind. His sisters held his property. His aging grandmother, who raised him, turned out to die in the woods when she was no longer useful.
He escaped the horrors, yet he carried the guilt of those he loved who could not follow.
The ultimate test of freedom, as Douglass reveals in these sources, is not just what you gain for yourself, the first free dollar, the career, the fame. It's the profound, wrenching sacrifice required for the sake of those loved ones who, because of the strong cords of affection, you must choose to leave behind in ignorance and bondage to secure your own life.
That separation, the agony of gaining liberty alone, is the heavy silence that eternally shadows the success of every escaped slave.
A truly provocative thought to leave with us, reminding us that freedom is often paid for by the deepest of human ties. Thank you for guiding us through this necessary and powerful revision of Frederick Douglass's life and legacy.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, share it with someone who needs the shortcut to being well informed. We'll see you next time.